Hello and welcome to Orientalism History, the podcast where we dive deep into the history of the Middle East. I'm your host Ahmed, and today we're exploring a pivotal moment in the post-Ottoman era, the Syrian Revolt of 1925 to 1927. Joining us is Professor Michael Provence, a distinguished historian specializing in the modern Middle East. Professor Provence is a faculty member at the University of California, San Diego, where his research focuses on the political, social, and military history of the region during the 20th century. He's also the author of several influential works, including The Great Syrian Revolt and The Rise of Arab Nationalism, which provide a deep dive into the events and impacts of this significant uprising. In today's episode, we'll be exploring the causes and the consequences of the Syrian Revolt, its impact on the newly formed post-Ottoman Middle East, and how it shaped the future of Arab nationalism. We'll also dive into the broader context of anti-colonial movements in the region and the lasting impact of the revolution shaping modern Syrian history. Thank you for joining me today, Dr. Michael. Today we'll be discussing the Syrian Revolt and post-Ottoman Empire, Middle East in general. So maybe we can get right into it. Can we maybe start off by talking about what is the Syrian Revolt in general? Can you provide an overview of it and what were its main causes?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. So the Syrian Revolt, the Great Syrian Revolt, or as it was called at the time in Arabic, the Thawra Wataniya, or the Thawra Suriya al-Wataniya. So it was the Syrian Patriotic Revolution, they called it at the time. Later on, people started to call it the Great Syrian Revolt. But so it happened in the summer of 1925, and this was about exactly 5 years after the fall of the very brief independent Syrian kingdom of Amir Faisal that was made famous in the David Lean movie, what did they call it? Seven Pillars of Wisdom, the T.E. Lawrence movie, or was that what it was called? Anyway.
Lawrence of Arabia, yes.
Thank you. Yeah, Lawrence of Arabia. Which, Lawrence was not an important figure actually, but much more important the people like Faisal and others. But anyway, so 5 years after the destruction of that brief British-sponsored kingdom in 1920, and about 6 years or 7 years after the end of the Great War, of the war that destroyed the Ottoman Empire and led to the occupation by Britain and France and the partition of the Ottoman Arab lands. And so those Ottoman Arab lands had been several Ottoman provinces, but they were undivided. So for example, if you needed to go from, say, what is today Saudi Arabia or very southern Jordan in Aqaba on the Red Sea to Aleppo, you could just get on the train and just go. And you could, you'd be there. It'd take you a couple days probably, but you could be on the train, and there were no borders, and there were no customs, and there were no controls of any kind. It was one country, and so people were accustomed to this idea, and so the idea of independence and freedom and opposition to French and British mandate or colonial occupation was kind of widespread everywhere. And so the Great Syrian Revolt was the biggest of a whole series of anti-colonial revolts and uprisings and insurgencies that happened all over the region, including what came to be called the Turkish War of Independence a couple years before. So it turns out that they're actually not very separate, and they were linked. And we can talk about the reasons why later on people separated them in the history books and talked about them separately. And we can also talk about the reasons why they all kind of belong together. But that's the kind of background. We're thinking about an unsettled period, a lot of dissatisfaction, and the destruction of the Great War that had just ended a few years before.
So it sounds like it's a far-reaching and anti-colonial movement at its core, and that's fundamentally what the Syrian Revolt is. Was it a grassroots revolt? Was it everyday people? Were there main leaders and groups that were involved in the revolt, or can you just briefly talk about who the main players were and how it was actually organized on the ground?
Yeah, sure. So there's a region of Syria, of what is today Syria, south of Damascus, called Jabal Hawran, or Mount Hawran, or Jabal Duruz, for the sectarian minority, the religious minority, the kind of esoteric Muslim minority, the Druze, who mostly live there. And it's a kind of a remote area of these volcanic hills, and it's fertile. And there were a number of Druze villages and big families, leading families. And among this family was a family called the Atrash family, which means death, named for one of their relatives, one of their ancestors. And deafness is actually something that is pretty prevalent or common in the region for genetic reasons. There's a lot of deaf people. Anyway, so this family had a son who had been an Ottoman conscript, and then during the course of the war, his name was Sultan al-Atrash. And during the course of the war, there's a picture of him that I keep around in a tent in 1929. Anyway, so Sultan was engaged in nationalist politics, but he was also engaged in the politics of his region as a kind of a leading young man of the region. He was in his early 30s. And he'd been trying to raise a revolt against the French occupation for a couple years. He'd been in exile. He'd been chased out of the country. His house had been bombed. And in 1925, a bunch of his cousins were invited to go talk to the High Commissioner, a French officer in Damascus, supposedly at dinner, and he kidnapped them and took them to prison. So this was considered a big insult and so Sultan used this as a reason to mobilize the people of the region. And so they started the revolt there. They shot down a French airplane, with regular Ottoman rifles left over from the war. The French tried to come and free those pilots, and they were unsuccessful. Their column was destroyed, and then another column was destroyed. So they were dramatically successful at fighting French forces early on. Now, there were other people in Damascus, the big city about 100 kilometers north, and they were paying attention, and they knew about this, and there were nationalist leaders and people who had been part of that brief independent government under Amir Faisal, and they said, "Okay, right, this is our moment. We're gonna challenge the occupation, and we're gonna defeat it." There was also an anti-colonial revolt taking place in Morocco, which was also a French colony, called the Rif Rebellion, RIF. And so these things were happening at the same time. And so the Syrians, the Damascenes, the Druze, the people in this region, they said, well, they're already fighting over there. And if we fight them over here, they won't be able to do both things, and we will have a chance to free our country. And so this became the idea, and it lasted for about 2 years. So there was a combination of nationalist politics from some people, local insult, the issue of autonomy, upholding local culture, and all of these things were kind of wrapped up together. And this is actually, anytime there's a kind of an anti-colonial uprising or an insurgency, the motives are always complicated, and lots of things are kind of intertwined and connected, So there's some people who are thinking about global revolution, and there's some things thinking about that guy insulted my grandmother. And, these people are they, because it's a mass movement, they have reason to struggle together, even if they have very different ideas about what the goal is, what the reasons for it are, and so forth.
So it started off in the south near Double Druze and near Damascus. What other regions of the Levant or Syria were affected? Did it reach up to Aleppo and Homs? Did it reach Latakia? Was it also in the Lebanon region, or was this kind of focused on the capital city of Damascus?
No, it was focused. Well, so there was an uprising in Hama, which is a city in between Damascus and Aleppo or Homs. So there's, Syria, what became the Syrian Mandate, now the Syrian Arab Republic, has several major cities. The major cities are Damascus, Aleppo in the north, very close to the Turkish border, and then two or three other large cities, Hama and Homs and Latakia. And the Hama rose in revolt. There was a captain who was an Ottoman officer, and he mutinied. He'd been in the French service. He mutinied. He'd led a force, and they captured the city. And then the French bombarded Hama with airplanes and artillery because they didn't have soldiers. And that happened, I think, in October. And then the next month, they bombarded Damascus for the same reason. So the countryside surrounding, especially this sort of southern central countryside, was basically outside of French control. There were activities and things that took place in Aleppo and in Latakia and other places, also in what had become Greater Lebanon, the mandate for Lebanon. But the focus of armed resistance was in the area around Damascus, including over what became the Lebanese border in towns in what's called Wadi Taim, which is a part of the anti-Lebanon mountains, closer to Damascus than to Beirut, a place called Hasbaya, Rashaya, and Marjayoun. These are kind of historic towns there. So it was kind of all over the place. Of course, people elsewhere paid attention in what became Jordan, or what was by that time Transjordan, also in Jerusalem, in the Palestine Mandate, but all over the place as well. I mean, it was in newspapers, especially the bombardment of Damascus was in newspapers all over the entire world, including all over the United States, the UK, France, and elsewhere. It was highly covered and fiercely debated whether this was, a barbaric assault on civilization by the French, or a colonial war against Druze fanatics. It was
interesting.
Yeah. So it was an international event, big one. And it also damaged very much the prestige of the League of Nations, which was this international, kind of the first international organization, which was intended to prevent the outbreak of another war, but also adjudicate the imperial rivalries between Britain and France in the Middle East and elsewhere. And in this, it failed miserably. And this was kind of the first indication that the League of Nations was not going to be able to manage these kind of conflicts.
So it sounds like eventually, the French won. They were able to suppress the revolt. What sort of impact did that have on the broader geopolitical landscape of the Middle East? Also considering the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire's collapse and the rise of these colonial holdings in the region.
Well, it's a good question. So there's a whole bunch of different. I mean, in a way, the victory on the part of France was very, very costly. And it's also important to point out that, the thing that when I was doing this research as a graduate student in Damascus, 20 years ago, there had been a revolt. There was the Iraq revolt, which took place in 1920. There had been this kind of battle in Syria also in 1920 in the summer, called Maysalun, between the French forces and the forces of King Faisal. There was the Turkish War of Independence, and I realized now the thing to point out is that all of these things, Turkey became an independent republic, Iraq was an independent country. Jordan became an independent country. Syria became an independent country. Lebanon became an independent country. All of these revolts were woven into the national historiography of those respective countries. So in other words, the Syrian revolt became the Syrian revolt, not the anti-colonial Middle Eastern pan-Arab revolt, which I would say it was. The Turkish War of Independence became not the Anatolian insurgency against the post-Ottoman occupation, which I would argue it was, but the Turkish War of Independence. So what became clear in looking at those sources was that all this stuff was related. All these people were fighting for the same thing in 1920, in 1922, in 1923, in 1924, and 1925. And that the revolts, all these people who were struggling were all trying to seize independence from the Ottoman collapse and the occupation of their countries. And so they were all connected. And in fact, there were lots of people who fought in all of them, actually, which is really, if they're separate nationalist revolts, why would somebody fight in the Turkish War of Independence, the Iraqi Revolt, the Syrian Revolt, and then the Palestinian Revolt in 1936? But in fact, there were lots of people who did that. And so this, if you think of them as separate national revolts, this kind of activity is inexplicable. It doesn't make sense. So what we want to think about is that there's one anti-colonial struggle in the whole region during the whole period. So from that perspective, the Syrian Revolt becomes a template for other kinds of revolts. The French had to change their governing arrangement. They wanted to sectarianize Syria in the same way that they sectarianized Lebanon, to privilege the Christians, to subordinate the Muslim majority, to privilege the Muslim minorities like the Druze and the Alawites and so forth. And the revolt made that project impossible. So for Syrians, in the wake of the revolt, the thing that they called for was Syrian unity. And by that, they meant as big a state as we can manage, including Lebanon. They wanted to incorporate Lebanon into larger Syria. And in fact, most of the people in Lebanon, what became Lebanon, wanted that too. So the idea of a separate Lebanon, sectarianized for the Lebanese Christians, was a minority opinion, not something that people in Tripoli, Saida, or most of the other Baalbek wanted. They wanted to be part of a larger, contiguous, unified Syrian state. And then in 1936, there was a revolt in Palestine, which led to big changes in the British mandate for Palestine, and that was absolutely inspired by not only the Syrian Revolt of 1925, but the Syrian general strike of 1936, which preceded the Palestine general strike of the same year. So there was a Syrian general strike in 1936, early, and that led to the French wanting to negotiate with the Syrian nationalist leaders, and they did. And then there was a Palestine general strike, which led to the Palestine Revolt that lasted from 1936 until really 1939. So, I think that the idea of anti-colonial resistance, and as you know, I'm sure, the Hamas military wing is called the Izzeddin al-Qassam brigades, which is named for the first martyr of the 1936 Palestine Revolt. So there's a continual line here that goes from all of these revolts to the idea of armed resistance in the region generally. Nobody remembers this, especially among, Brits, Americans, Canadians. But in 2003, when the Americans invaded Iraq, the first anti-occupation, anti-invasion grassroots movement that emerged called themselves, okay, you ready for this? The Patriotic Soldiers of 1920. So that indicates and shows vividly, I think, that the memory of these anti-colonial revolts and struggles and their martyrs from the period of the settlement in 1918, 1920 continues until today in the region.
So the Syrians were fighting for a kind of their freedom from a colonial overlord, but they also were against the sectarianization of their country. What were the outcomes of the revolt? So it sounds like they lost, but were they able to extract concessions from the French authorities?
Well, not directly. I mean, the people who were in charge were all exiled, usually under threat of death. Like this picture that I showed you of Sultan al-Atrash. This is him living in a tent as a refugee in what became, and you can see the tent is in the background there, in what became Saudi Arabia, in a place called Wadi Sirhan. So they lived there from 1927 to 1937. So they were removed, but the French allowed other people to come back and take part, if they had not been rebels. And they abandoned the idea of sectarian fragmentation. So, I mean, for the most part, they still kind of messed around with it, but it never, Syria never had a sectarian political system like Lebanon did. So, the French did allow a kind of an indigenous political structure to take place, parties, elections, a constitution. It was rigged and it was kind of fake, but it did take place. I would say that, these political systems that were set up made a kind of a miserable inheritance, because they created a facade of democracy without any real representation. So they kind of laid the groundwork for dictatorship and fake democratic structures. I think the same thing happened in Iraq under the British. But that's kind of a topic for another day.
So it sounds like we're still facing the consequences of this revolt, and among the conflicts or revolts that you mentioned, it's true, based on my understanding, that the only one that was successful was the quote unquote Turkish Code of Independence. Is there a thread in that success linking why Turkey today is, considerably much more, let's say, successful, developed, etc., than the countries where these revolts failed? Or is this grasping too much?
No, I don't think so. I mean, self-determination matters. And I mean, it wouldn't, to me, the countries of the Arab Middle East have been basically under colonial and imperial domination from the moment of their birth in 1920. And it's the case. I mean, today Syria is essentially a satellite of Russia and Iran. And there was a period of some decades. This is a consequence of the revolution of 2011. And Jordan is a satellite of the United States. Egypt is a kind of a satellite of the United States. Turkey is, more independent than these other countries. Iran is more independent than these other countries. It had a revolution. It got out of the orbit of the United States. But, like I say, the other countries are still, because of their geopolitical importance, because of long habit. In 1950, essentially, the British and the French were forced to exit the region, and the Americans stepped in and immediately began to do the same kind of mischief and tampering with people's self-determination and political structures that the British and the French had done. So, this is an old story, and it's been the case, and many scholars have argued this, that the political elites of some of these countries are forced to serve the needs of their foreign sponsors before they consider serving the needs of the citizens of the countries. So, that's a pretty miserable kind of an unfortunate inheritance for the people of the region, I would say. So it's a long, nasty, and unpleasant hangover from this period after the First World War.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit more about how the outcomes of the Syrian revolt shaped the future of Syrian nationalism and broader Arab nationalism in general? I think there was a massive resurgence in Arab nationalism under Nasser in Egypt and so on. Was the Syrian revolt a key factor or key driving, you know, root cause of this broader nationalism?
Sure. Yeah. So it was for certain. I mean, the people who became the leaders of, or the intellectual leaders of especially Ba'athist Arab nationalism in the period after independence and around independence in the 40s were shaped absolutely by the Great Revolt. In fact, the Ba'ath Party was led by two teachers, Salahuddin Bitar and Michel Aflaq. And Aflaq was from the region, actually. His father had been a grain merchant in Hauran, in the place where, and was a friend of Sultan al-Atrash, and Sultan al-Atrash's son, Mansur al-Atrash, became an early leader in the Ba'ath Party. So the secular socialist Arab nationalism, in its intellectual and ideological form, was shaped absolutely by the example and the struggle, and most specifically by the secularism, non-sectarian character, and also democratic character of the Great Revolt. So, I mean, that's for sure something very significant. Later on, things were changed in various ways. Military officers came and basically supplanted, and in some cases persecuted, the civilians who were more democratic, more secular, more, I guess, they were less authoritarian, and that's what happened in the late 60s and 70s. But the example of the Great Revolt has remained potent until today. It's also the case, of course, that the Syrian Revolution of 2011 started in roughly the same region, in the south, in a town called Dara, which was the first place. So this is a long history with a lot of connections and continuity and consistent themes, we can say. So between the countryside and the city, and the places where revolts and uprisings happen, and the places where they spread. So in other words, they have started in the countryside and spread to the cities.
So you mentioned there the anti-sectarian kind of secular nature of Arab nationalism and the Syrian revolt. How did the Syrian revolt reflect or affect the relationship between different religious and ethnic groups within Syria and across the Middle East? And what, if any, is that effect today?
Well, so at the time of the revolt, Sultan al-Atrash, so it's important to note that the leaders of the revolt are members of a religious minority. So if Syria is a very religiously diverse country. So the people who are committed to a Syrian national and Arab identity are not interested in advocating an exclusivist Muslim or Sunni identity, because it excludes 20% of the population who can't participate. The Baathists made an argument that Islam and the example of the Prophet Muhammad was an exemplar of Arab identity, and that Islamic culture is Arab culture, and they made this argument. Other people had other kinds of ideological positions about Syrianism in the place of somebody like Antoun Sade. But for the Baathists, Islam was the fount of Arab identity, but Arab nationalism and identity and citizenship was a secular thing. And Sultan al-Atraf said, religion is, what did he say? The nation belongs to, religion belongs to the individual, and the nation belongs to everybody, something like this. I paraphrase. I can remember the Arabic, but I don't. The translation is a precise. Translation is escaping me a little bit. So this was a position that people advocated, and so a lot of the PLO, the Ba'ath Party, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, George Habash's Arab National Movement. All of these groups were officially secular, Arab nationalist and secular, so that they could incorporate all of the Arabic-speaking people of the region into a cohesive, collective Arab movement. So they were committed to that, and of course in Lebanon, secularism and equal citizenship of everybody, one person, one vote, no sectarian, was part of the position and remains part of the position of the Arab nationalists and the leftist parties combined. So leftism, leftists politics, Arab nationalist politics, almost always embraced a kind of a secular model of citizenship.
So it sounds very secular, very Arab nationalist, but what were the views of those people in regards to non-Arabs? So, Turkmen, Kurds, and so on.
Yeah, well, I mean, essentially they said, well, it's a bit like the French conception of citizenship, which is to say, if you speak French and you say you're French, you're French. But you don't. I mean, and some people are more French than other people, whether anyone wants to admit that or not. So, and it's necessary, or at least some people would say that it's necessary to jettison, to forget, to ignore, even to suppress other parts of your individual identity. So, like in Syria, there were lots of Kurds who actually weren't citizens. And they didn't, Kurdish education, for example, wasn't as rigorously suppressed as in Turkey, but it was suppressed. Certain minority identities, religions were kind of not threatening, and others were threatening. So the Kurdish identity was a little threatening to the state. Armenians, not so much, in Syria. So you could go to your Armenian school, no problem, but you couldn't go to your Kurdish school. So there's kind of a fiction that everybody's an Arab. Whether people want to, these are all rather, there's lots of nuances and lots of complications and lots of wrinkles, but, in theory and in practice, everybody could be a citizen of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of kind of the Syrian revolt's influence on the future governance and political structure of Syria, do we see that influence and political structure today? Obviously, Syria is still ruled by the Ba'ath Party, which is on paper at least an Arab nationalist party. Is there any long lingering influence of the Syrian revolt in Syria and across the region in general?
Well, locally. So it's important in the south, and it's something that people remember. But the government itself, because of its sectarian character and its minority character. So the thing about the Syrian revolt is that the regions, that the coastal northern regions, were not involved. And so in the 60s, as people like Hafez al-Assad from that region and from the Alawi minority became more dominant, the importance of the revolt in the national narrative was suppressed. So it became less prominent. It became more kind of, you know, subversive almost. And that has sort of remained, if you see what I mean. So, I mean, the revolt was a kind of a historic collaboration between Sunni Muslims of Damascus and Druze minority from the south, and the Alawites from the northwest were not involved. And so, you know, the historic, heroic character of the revolt was something that the government was not interested in emphasizing later on. So, you know, this is how kind of history and politics interact. Now, the other thing that I would say is that the Syrian or the French mandate became a republic, but not a real republic, a kind of a fake republic where there's all of these legal structures that exist, but there's also an overarching high commissioner and military intelligence structure in the background that actually runs everything.
Mm.
And so so you have the facade of democracy, you have the facade of representative government, you have the facade of rule of law, but the actual structure of the state is based on a high commissioner who can, you know, seize your house, throw you in prison, and execute you at his pleasure at any time through his minions of the what is called the sécurité, the French intelligence service. So now, when the military takes over the government in the 1950s, they replicate this structure.
Mm.
So you still have a parliament, you still have a constitution, you still have civilian law courts, but they can't do anything. And the intelligence services and the executive, which is to say the head of state, the high commissioner, now the president, are actually the places where power resides. And so all the rest of it is kind of a cosmetic facade. So I think that we can say that this is an inheritance of the colonial structure, because in the mandate is devised as a kind of a PR operation to convince French people to support their empire. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So, you know, the empire, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the French Empire, the British Empire, or the American Empire, is really expensive and doesn't deliver any benefits for the citizens of the metropole. So today, you know, American citizens don't really derive any benefit from the fact that they have military bases all over the entire world that they pay for. And French people didn't derive any benefit from the fact that they had an empire that spanned the entire globe. In fact, there were all kinds of things their government couldn't do because it had to pay for that empire. If you see what I mean. So there was a need at that time for the empire to be civilized, for it to be fostering development in the mandates, for it to be democratic, for it to have a parliament and a constitution. But that wasn't intended for the people who lived in the mandate. It was intended for the PR of the people in France or in Britain. Same thing with Palestine and Iraq and India and other places. The British citizens paying the taxes in Manchester had to believe that their government was engaged in some kind of altruistic activity. In Britain, they say good government.
Yeah.
We took good government to the empire.
Yeah.
Good government of, you know, torture, arbitrary detention, and authoritarianism, but good government. You see what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in the period of decolonization, these legacies are really detrimental to the people who are forced to live with these legal, political, and military structures.
So you mentioned it briefly about how the Syrian revolt was similar to other anti-colonial movements in the Middle East during the same period. What influence did it have on kind of broader, if any, anti-colonial movements, such as the Algerian War of Independence, anti-colonial movements in let's say Egypt and Sudan, in maybe as far as India? Was it as that far-reaching? I think Morocco and Algeria would be a good example, given they're also French-controlled colonies.
Well, I hope somebody does that research, but I haven't done it. So I leave that to today's graduate students and people who are doing historical research and writing dissertations and books at the moment. But I can speculate, and based on things I saw in the archives and my exposure to newspapers. So, if you lived in Damascus in 1925, you were reading all the time about what was going on in Morocco and Algeria and other places, and also in Palestine and in Iraq and in India, and people were always engaged in those kinds of struggles, and always knew what was going on. So the newspapers were full, and of course, people felt deeply that they were all engaged in a similar kind of a struggle. It reminds me of the famous anecdote when somebody asked Mahatma Gandhi what he thought of Western civilization, and he said, "It seems like a good
Nice,
idea."
yeah, yes.
So, if we went and looked at Indian newspapers in 1925, we would find that they were full of reports about the Great Revolt in Syria. And there's two reasons for this. The first reason is because the Indian population was interested in the story of anti-colonial resistance elsewhere in the world. That's the first thing. And the second thing is because the Great Revolt was against France, the British censors were not threatened by coverage of an anti-French, anti-colonial revolt in Syria. So they would cover it. Now, if we went and looked at those same Indian newspapers in 1936 during the Great Palestine Revolt, we would find that it would be censored.
Yeah.
But if we go to Algeria, we would find that the Algerian newspapers were full of coverage because the French wouldn't censor. In fact, they liked gloating about the misfortune of their colonial imperial rival in their colonies. So these are interesting wrinkles that I think we can identify. So, and the same thing is true if you, for example, were an anti-colonial rebel against the French mandate in 1925 and you get exiled, you might be able to go to Cairo, under British colonial rule. You might be able to go to India. You might be able to go to Iraq, because the British, they're not worried about you. You're an enemy of the French mandate, but they don't like the French mandate either, really. So, so these kinds of people, people were clever, and they exploited these kinds of divisions.
Interesting. Well, thank you, Dr. Michael, for that. Is there anything that I've missed about this topic that you think the people need to know about?
No, I mean, thank you for asking, Ahmed. It's always a pleasure to talk and have good questions and a thoughtful discussion. So I'm really grateful. I mean, I followed the story, like I mentioned before. I kind of, as a researcher, you always find surprising things, and you want to follow those things. So, I wrote the Great Syrian Revolt, and then I realized that it was a regional, global, or what we might say a transnational story. So the other book, the Last Ottoman Generation, is a continuation of the same similar kind of story. Trying to figure out what it felt like in 1930 to be, a citizen of French mandate Syria, paying attention to Palestine, to Iraq, caring a lot about what happened in all these post-Ottoman countries, and remembering the moment when they were the long time when they were all one country, when people were, felt and were in charge of their own destiny and their own systems, and trying to retrieve and try to recover that autonomy and freedom and self-determination. And I think in a way people are still, there's a lot of nostalgia in the region, and that's, I think, partly because people are realizing that, that in some ways things have been better, or at least more free in the past.
Well, I recommend our listeners to get those two books, The Last Ottoman Generation and The Great Syrian Revolt, right? Is that correct?
That's right. They're also in the library. You don't have to buy them.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mike, Professor Michael. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you, and
Thank you. Thank you.
thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much.